At 04:37 a.m., radar screens across the North Atlantic Command Center lit up red. Unknown signatures, fast, low, moving toward the U.S. naval fleet near Iceland. Operators froze for a second, then alarms blared. "Possible Russian launch detected," a calm voice reported. Within seconds, American destroyers went on high alert. Fighter jets scrambled, satellites locked on. The world held its breath. This was no drill, it was the start of something bigger, a moment that would test U.S. firepower like never before. Stay till the end, because what happened next will shock you. Like this video, subscribe, and press the bell icon. This story will change how you see modern warfare forever. For months before that morning, tension had been building like a slow-moving storm. The year was 2025, and the fragile balance between Russia and the United States was cracking. What started as political pressure over sanctions had turned into open military rivalry. Intelligence reports warned of an increase in Russian bomber patrols near NATO airspace. American analysts noticed new missile silos being activated in the Arctic Circle. The world was watching, uneasy and uncertain. In Washington, military leaders reviewed satellite images daily. Russian movements in the Barents Sea looked deliberate. Submarines were surfacing closer to NATO routes. The Pentagon issued quiet alerts, raising readiness levels for the U.S. Sixth Fleet stationed in the North Atlantic. Officially, the message was calm, but inside command rooms, tension was rising. Every officer knew one wrong move could ignite a global crisis. Across the ocean, Moscow was watching too. The Kremlin accused the U.S. of provoking conflict through aggressive exercises. Russian media aired footage of Tu-160 bombers flying near the edge of NATO airspace. State officials said it was all routine, but the timing told another story. Russia was signaling that it would not back down. Behind the headlines, both sides were running shadow operations. U.S. drones scanned the Arctic, tracking heat signatures from mobile missile units. Russian hackers targeted American radar networks, testing their defenses. The invisible war was already happening, far from public view. Then came the first warning sign. On March 8, 2025, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft reported a near collision with a Russian Su-35 fighter jet over the Baltic Sea. The jet had flown dangerously close, less than 10 feet away. The U.S. filed a formal protest. Moscow ignored it. Days later, Russian ships began shadowing an American destroyer group moving through the Norwegian Sea. Military observers called it a pattern of intimidation. But in truth, both sides were testing limits. Russia wanted to prove it could challenge U.S. dominance near its borders. The United States wanted to show it would not be bullied. The standoff was turning personal, a silent contest of pride and power. By April, the situation reached a breaking point. NATO announced a massive exercise called Northern Resolve. The operation involved over 22,000 troops, 150 aircraft, and 60 naval vessels from 10 allied nations. Officially, it was about training for Arctic defense, but everyone knew it was aimed at Russia. The message was clear. The alliance could still project power anywhere on Earth. Russia answered with its own drills. Thunder Shield 2025. It mobilized strategic bombers, missile brigades, and electronic warfare units. For the first time, Russian forces simulated strikes on NATO communication hubs. Television broadcasts showed the launch of hypersonic Kinzhal missiles from MiG-31 jets. Moscow wanted the world to see its strength. Behind closed doors, American intelligence was worried. Reports indicated that some Russian units were moving real warheads, not dummies. This wasn't just theater anymore. One report warned, the line between exercise and operation is disappearing. Economically, the world felt the heat. Oil prices spiked by 15%, stock markets dipped. European leaders held emergency meetings, urging both sides to step back. But the rhetoric kept rising. Russian officials accused Washington of plotting to encircle Russia. U.S. senators called for decisive containment. Diplomacy was fading, replaced by military posturing. Inside the White House Situation Room, the tone was serious. Advisors to the president debated how to respond without escalating. The U.S. Navy increased patrols in the North Atlantic, while stealth bombers from Whiteman Air Force Base were quietly deployed to the U.K. Meanwhile, American cyber units were authorized to conduct defensive intrusions, scanning Russian networks for possible threats. In early May, a classified NSA memo described something alarming. Encrypted Russian military traffic spiked across multiple time zones. Analysts noted coordination between northern naval bases and southern radar stations. This wasn't routine. It looked like the start of a major operation. By the end of that week, satellites detected unusual heat signatures at Murmansk, Russia's largest Arctic base. Long-range missiles were being rolled out and fueled. It was the clearest signal yet that Moscow was preparing for something serious. At the same time, the USS Roosevelt, an American destroyer, picked up faint sonar echoes off the coast of Iceland. The crew suspected a Russian submarine, possibly an Akula-class attack sub. When sonar pings confirmed movement, the Roosevelt went into silent running. Orders came from above. Hold position, track, do not engage. Every soldier, sailor, and analyst involved felt it. The silence before the storm. Years of tension had led to this razor-thin moment. Two nuclear powers, both armed, both alert, both unwilling to blink first. Then came June the 2nd, 2025, the day everything changed. At 02:46 a.m. on June the 2nd, 2025, the Arctic sky was dark and silent. The air crackled with cold wind as the U.S. Navy's Task Force 47 patrolled near Iceland. On board the USS Roosevelt, radar screens flickered with faint blips. At first, they looked like false returns, just static. But then the signals multiplied. They were fast, coordinated, and heading straight toward the fleet. Within seconds, the Roosevelt's Combat Information Center went from calm to chaos. "Multiple inbound tracks, bearing 078, speed Mach 6, an officer shouted. The room froze. Mach 6 meant only one thing: hypersonic weapons. Commander Reed, the Roosevelt's captain, issued the order. Activate Aegis, lock targets. The ship's radar system, designed to track hundreds of threats, began identifying the incoming objects. The system flagged 3 as Russian Zircon missiles, likely launched from a submarine or coastal battery. Each missile could hit its target in under 5 minutes. Across the Atlantic, in the U.S. European Command Headquarters, alarms went off. Screens flashed red as missile-tracking satellites confirmed the launch. Analysts couldn't believe it. This wasn't a test. These missiles were on a live trajectory. Immediate orders went out. DEFCON 3, intercept if possible. At 02:48 a.m., the Roosevelt Standard Missile 6 interceptors launched in sequence. Each one shot upward, slicing through the freezing night. The sound of the launch thundered across the sea. Sailors held their breath. They knew they were witnessing something historic, the first real-world test of America's missile shield against hypersonic weapons. 2 minutes later, one of the Zircon missiles exploded mid-air, intercepted successfully. But the second missile slipped through. It veered suddenly, changing altitude and speed. The Aegis system struggled to lock back on. Hypersonic weapons didn't fly like normal missiles. They maneuvered unpredictably, making defense almost impossible. At 02:50 a.m., the missile dropped altitude, racing just above the waves. It missed the Roosevelt by less than a mile before plunging into the ocean. The explosion created a shock wave so strong that it rattled the ship's hull. Crew members were thrown from their stations. One sailor suffered a fractured arm. In Moscow, Russian state channels were already calling it a demonstration. Officials said it was a defensive readiness drill to test Western response times. But the message was clear. Russia could strike near U.S. assets anytime, anywhere. Back in Washington, the National Security Council went into emergency session. The president was briefed immediately. Military advisors debated the next step. Some argued for restraint, saying the missiles didn't hit any U.S. ship. Others wanted an immediate show of force. "We can't let this go unanswered," one general said flatly. The U.S. response came quickly but carefully. At 04:00 a.m., 2 B-2 Spirit bombers took off from RAF Fairford in the UK. Their mission was not to strike, but to signal readiness. They flew toward the Norwegian Sea, flanked by F-35 escorts. Russian radar picked them up instantly. Within minutes, Russian fighters scrambled to shadow them. For nearly 40 minutes, both sides flew dangerously close, at times less than 20 miles apart. Each side locked radar on the other, but no shots were fired. It was a silent standoff, power against power, nerve against nerve. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy sonar detected the source of the earlier missile launch, a Yasin-class submarine, one of Russia's most advanced. It was hiding deep in the North Atlantic Trench. When destroyers moved to track it, the sub dove and vanished. American sonar operators called it ghost-level stealth. By dawn, global news networks broke the story. Headlines flashed. Russian hypersonic missiles fired near U.S. fleet. Stock markets dipped. Oil prices surged overnight. European leaders called for calm. The UN Security Council scheduled an emergency session. But behind the scenes, both militaries were quietly repositioning. In the following 24 hours, U.S. cyber units traced unusual data traffic between Russian defense networks. Analysts believed Moscow was testing America's electronic response. At the same time, NATO radar sites from Norway to Poland went on high alert. Fighter squadrons were put on standby. For the sailors aboard the Roosevelt, the mood was heavy. They knew how close they had come. One officer later said, "If that missile had hit, the world would have woken up in a different era." In total, the confrontation lasted less than 12 minutes, but its impact rippled across the world. It wasn't war, but it was close, dangerously close. By that evening, both nations denied responsibility for escalation. Russia claimed it had been routine testing. The U.S. stated it had acted in measured defense, yet everyone knew the truth. It was a deliberate challenge, a warning shot in the new age of warfare. And what followed, the analysis, the decoding, the realization, would change everything about how nations viewed modern power. What happened that night was not just about courage or quick decisions. It was about technology, raw, unmatched, and terrifying in its speed. Experts later called it a test of 21st century warfare. Both nations had revealed their cards, showing what modern power really meant. Let's start with Russia. The missiles fired near the U.S. fleet were believed to be 3M-22 Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles. They could travel at speeds over Mach 8 or around 6,000 miles per hour. That's faster than a bullet and nearly impossible to intercept once launched. Powered by a scramjet engine, these missiles flew low, hugging the ocean surface to stay invisible to radar. Each Zircon carried either a 450-kilogram conventional warhead or, in theory, a small nuclear payload. In simple terms, one missile could destroy a destroyer. The launch platform was suspected to be a Yasin-class submarine, one of Russia's newest and most advanced designs. Each sub carried up to 40 missiles, including Caliber, Onyx, and Zircon. Powered by a nuclear reactor, it could stay underwater for months, operating almost silently. U.S. sonar systems called it the black hole, because once it dived, it was nearly impossible to detect. This wasn't old Soviet technology. It was a signal. Russia had reached a new level of sophistication. In recent years, Moscow had spent billions on modernizing its strategic arsenal, focusing on weapons that could bypass U.S. missile defenses. Systems like the Avangard glide vehicle, the Sarmat ICBM, and Kinzhal air-launched hypersonic missiles were all part of the same strategy. Strike fast, strike unpredictably, and avoid detection. Now the United States wasn't far behind. The Aegis combat system aboard the USS Roosevelt was one of the most advanced defense networks ever built. It used AN/SPY-1 radar arrays and SM-6 interceptors capable of tracking threats hundreds of miles away. The SM-6 missile, designed for both air defense and limited anti-ballistic use, could reach speeds over Mach 3.5. But against hypersonic targets, even that wasn't enough. The Zircon's unpredictable flight path and speed gave operators only 90 seconds to react. To put it simply, defending against a hypersonic strike is like trying to hit a fastball that changes direction midair. The U.S. was already developing new systems to meet that threat. The Glide Phase Interceptor, GPI, was being tested to target hypersonic missiles during their mid-course flight. Meanwhile, the Space Development Agency had launched early warning satellites equipped with infrared sensors designed to track heat signatures in real time. On the cyber side, U.S. Cyber Command had created digital tripwires, automated systems that could detect and respond to electronic warfare signals from adversaries within seconds. In this confrontation, those systems were pushed to their limits. Analysts later found that the U.S. Aegis system intercepted one missile through a combination of radar triangulation and thermal tracking, supported by satellite relay from Space Force Command. It was the first recorded instance of a U.S. naval defense system successfully neutralizing a hypersonic threat. But it also exposed gaps, dangerous ones. According to post-incident analysis, the second missile went undetected for over 47 seconds due to radar distortion caused by electronic jamming. That interference likely came from a Russian Krasuka-4 electronic warfare system positioned along the Kola Peninsula. The system emitted powerful radio waves that confused enemy radar, making it appear as if the missile had vanished. The near miss forced both sides to rethink everything. U.S. intelligence began studying Russian battlefield electronic warfare doctrine, which focused on blinding, confusing, and isolating opponents before firing. Russia, on the other hand, studied how quickly the U.S. command chain reacted, from radar detection to interceptor launch. That data alone was priceless. Beyond missiles and submarines, another silent front was cyber warfare. During the incident, U.S. communication systems experienced short blackouts, brief, but enough to raise suspicion. Cyber analysts later confirmed that Russian-linked malware had attempted to penetrate encrypted military channels. While it failed, the attempt showed that the next war might begin not with missiles, but with code. In the aftermath, the Pentagon conducted internal simulations. They estimated that if a real war broke out, a single Russian hypersonic strike could destroy a carrier group in under 15 minutes. On the other hand, U.S. forces could neutralize Russia's surface fleet and air defenses within hours using precision-guided systems like the Tomahawk Block V and long-range anti-ship missile, LRASM. It was a balance of terror, speed versus precision. Russia held the edge in hypersonic technology. The U.S. held dominance in detection, coordination, and global reach. Together, they formed a stalemate that was both powerful and fragile. Every expert agreed on one thing. The Arctic confrontation wasn't just a military test. It was a data war, a contest of sensors, codes, and algorithms, and it showed how close humanity stood to the edge of an unstoppable high-speed disaster. When the smoke cleared, it became clear that this was no isolated incident. It was a warning, one that echoed in every command room from Washington to Moscow. In the hours after the incident, the world was on edge. Communication between Washington and Moscow went silent. Both sides raised alert levels, but neither wanted open war. By sunrise, diplomats began to move. The Swiss government opened private communication lines between U.S. and Russian envoys. The first message was simple: de-escalate, avoid misunderstanding. Behind closed doors, both nations agreed to classify the event as a technical misfire. Official statements used the same careful words. Russia claimed it was a routine training drill. The U.S. said it had responded appropriately under defense protocol. The truth, that both sides came seconds from disaster, stayed hidden from the public. Still, the effects were immediate. The United Nations Security Council met in emergency session. European leaders demanded restraint. NATO moved additional surveillance aircraft to Norway and the Baltic states. New satellite constellations were ordered for early warning systems. For the first time, NATO's Arctic Defense Command operated in 24-hour monitoring mode. Inside the Pentagon, briefings went deep into the night. Analysts played back every radar trace, every data packet, every second of communication between the Roosevelt and command centers. The conclusion was sobering. U.S. forces had succeeded, but barely. One more failed intercept, and history might have changed forever. In Moscow, the Kremlin broadcast a message of strength. State media praised the Russian Navy's flawless readiness. Footage of missile tests replayed for days, framing the event as a victory for national defense. Inside Russian military circles, commanders celebrated how effectively their hypersonic systems had challenged the world's most powerful navy without starting a war. Markets reacted fast. Oil prices rose above $120 a barrel. The U.S. dollar briefly dipped as investors rushed to gold. Global shipping routes near the Arctic were halted for 48 hours. It was a reminder that one regional confrontation could shake the entire global economy. The crisis ended officially 36 hours later when both sides agreed to re-establish military communication channels through NATO AS hotline. The White House released a short statement emphasizing continued deterrence and peace. But the mood was tense. No one in Washington believed the incident was accidental. It was calculated, a test of resolve. In the weeks that followed, NATO increased its Arctic presence by 40%. The U.S. Navy began deploying new sensor buoys and anti-submarine drones. Congress approved an emergency defense budget, adding $58 billion to accelerate hypersonic defense projects. Meanwhile, Russian engineers pushed forward new prototypes of their Zircon M missile, capable of even greater range and speed. The near war of June 2025 didn't end in fire. It ended in silence. A fragile silence held together by diplomacy and fear. Both nations stepped back. But the line between peace and war had never been thinner. The confrontation had changed military thinking forever. And even as leaders shook hands and cameras flashed, satellites above the Arctic continued to move, watching, waiting, and ready for what might come next. The world moved on, but the memory of that night never faded. In every command center, every naval base, and every government office, one thought stayed the same: how close humanity had come to the edge. For 12 minutes, the balance of power between two great nations nearly broke. And if it had, the consequences would have been unthinkable. Military experts called it a modern Cuban Missile Crisis. But this time, there were no visible missiles on land, no public speeches, no warning lines drawn on a map. Everything happened in silence, beneath the sea, across computer screens, inside encrypted messages. The new battlefield wasn't about geography anymore. It was about data, speed, and nerve. Both sides learned something that day. The United States realized that superiority in numbers wasn't enough in an age of hypersonic speed. Power now meant how quickly you could detect, decide, and respond. Russia, on the other hand, learned that testing limits could backfire, that even a demonstration could bring the world within seconds of war. The confrontation of 2025 proved that modern warfare is no longer about invasion or occupation. It's about deterrence through precision. It is about showing strength without firing a shot, and praying the other side understands the message. For ordinary people, the story came and went as a headline. But behind those headlines were thousands of men and women, sailors, pilots, analysts, who stared at screens that could have changed history. They didn't fire out of anger. They acted out of duty. And because of that restraint, millions slept through a night that could have ended the modern world. In the months that followed, both nations signed new security agreements. But experts know peace built on fear is fragile. One cyber glitch, one radar error, one false alarm, that's all it would take to turn a standoff into a catastrophe. When future historians study 2025, they may not remember the names of ships or commanders, but they'll remember the lesson that in the race for faster, smarter, deadlier weapons, control matters more than power. Because in the end, the strongest weapon on Earth isn't firepower, it's restraint.